Hello, colleagues, and welcome back. Thank you for your prompt return. I'm now very pleased to welcome onto the stage our speakers for our panel discussion, What Works, Challenges and Opportunities in Taking an Evidence-Informed Approach. The panel will be chaired by Dr. Omar Khan, Director of TASO, which is the Centre for Transforming Access and Student Outcomes in Higher Education. He will introduce the speakers in a moment, but just to introduce Dr. Khan, he joined TASO in June 2020, and he's led TASO's transition into an independent charity, developing its team and strategy to widen participation in higher education and eliminate equality gaps between students. He joined TASO from race equality think tank the Runnymede Trust, where he'd been a director since 2014, growing the organisation and increasing its profile. Prior to that, Omar was head of policy at the Runnymede Trust and led its financial inclusion programme. So we're delighted that he's doing that valuable work at TASO. We're delighted that he's here today. Omar.
Thank you, John. You've got the names of the panelists in front of you, but I will introduce them just so you can put the names, the faces to the names. So to my far left is Professor Becky Francis. She's the CEO of the Education Endowment Foundation, as you can see there. To my immediate left is Dr. Claire Crawford, Associate Professor at the UCL Center for Education Policy and Equalizing Opportunities. To my right is Susie Wiggum, the interim CEO of the Brilliant Club. And then to my far right is Angela Kale, the Director of Consulting at New Philanthropy Capital. So as you saw in the earlier sessions, we're first going to have a conversation here on stage, then we'll take some questions from the audience, and then we'll take some questions from the many of you who have joined us online today. And it's delightful to be here in person, but it's also great to continue to have mixed events because you get that extra numbers, and I know there are a lot of people in the sector who are keen to learn from our panel today. So the first question from me, and I'm going to have every panelist answer this question, is what one thing, and I hope it's one thing, but I anticipate that there might be more than one thing, that would you suggest to help higher education providers take an evidence-informed approach to their work on raising attainment? So I'll start with you.
Thank you, Omar. It's really great to be here today. For those of you who don't know New Philanthropy Capital, we're a charity think tank and consultancy, and really we're about the use of evidence in making sort of charitable decisions. So it's great to be able to talk to you about that. And there's lots of colleagues on the panel who I'm sure know the evidence base in this area a lot better than me, and they've built it up in great ways. And I think that's a really important thing to be using is the sort of existing evidence base. But the one thing that I think providers should be focusing on at the moment is user data. And I say that because we've had 2 years of the biggest disruption that there could be to education. So we need to be really confident that the decisions that we're making about what we're going to use are based on the best data. And things that are based on evidence from more than 2 years ago, we need to be confident that actually the needs of the users are still the same now as they were then. So Amanda was talking earlier about some of the changes that we're seeing in where people are going to university, and we can think through some of the potential reasons for that. People might be choosing universities closer to home because they're worried about money, because they're worried about mental health, because they're worried about a lockdown. And therefore, I think it's really important to understand what are people thinking about right now, what are the demographics that you're really looking to attract, and think through actually what can I do that will really hit those points. So that is the one thing that I'm going to recommend.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, so for those of you that don't know the Brilliant Club, we support underrepresented pupils to develop the skills and confidence to progress to university and to succeed when they're there. And in terms of the one thing, now I am sure we will come on to RCTs at some point in this discussion. We have used one and would definitely advocate them. But I'm going to talk more broadly about our outcomes approach to an outcomes framework that has been so critical for us at the Brilliant Club. And that's looking at developing a framework that has a focus on both intermediate outcomes and long-term outcomes. And that's something I would really advocate for all WP interventions. So to give a very brief bit of context, our intermediate outcomes for our Scholars Programme include things like critical thinking, self-efficacy, written communication, subject knowledge. And we measure those with baseline and final assignments, and then also we use pre and post surveys. But then for our long-term outcomes, we include an annual analysis using UCAS STRO data. And that is incredibly important to us because it's shown us that Year 12 students who undertake the Scholars Programme are statistically more likely to progress to a highly selective university than their peers who are in a sort of large-scale match control group. And I think if I was going to sum up why it's so important to have both intermediate and long-term outcomes, they do very different things for us. So the long-term outcomes give us that confidence that our work really is supporting those underrepresented students to progress to university. We know that our mission really is working. But the intermediate outcomes allow us to use that data in a formative way. So we can give schools school impact reports, they can see the direct impact straight after the intervention on the students, and then we can play around with that data and really use it in a formative way. So we've analysed things like what's the impact if we add on a 7th tutorial to the Scholars Programme? What's the impact if we enhance our parental engagement and the messaging we give to parents? What's been the difference in the pandemic between virtual versus in-person? And it is those intermediate outcomes that give us that data straight away that we can play around with and then really understand how we can enhance the impact. So it's a combination of the two, which I know isn't always easy, but I think is the most powerful one to take.
Yeah, I think it's a really important message. We heard on the earlier panel, Greg referred to sort of the building blocks that lead to attainment, and I'm going to now turn to my next two panelists to sort of build on that response, thinking about, also which of those intermediate outcomes, those intermediate measures might be most strongly correlated or causally influence attainment raising. But I will give you the question again, because I've given you another question. What one thing would you suggest to help higher education providers take an evidence-based approach?
Thanks. So I'm going to slightly stretch the definition of one thing, I guess, and take a two-pronged approach, which is not all providers will be in a position where they have the capacity or the capability of evaluating all of the programs that they're undertaking, and that's probably not a desirable thing to be wanting to do anyway. But what you can do is to really draw, as Abigail was saying, on the existing evidence base and inform what you're doing, thinking through your theory of change as to how your program is going to work, which outcomes is it going to affect, and what does the evidence say about the best ways to go about achieving that. And then you can also link that in a second stage, I guess, to thinking along the lines that we heard in the first session from Greg, perhaps, and also from Susie, about not necessarily always targeting that final attainment outcome, for example, or whichever other outcomes you're interested in, but also thinking what are the important intermediate steps along the way, and how are those intermediate steps linked to what you're ultimately interested in, and what the evidence says about those best intermediate outcomes to focus on. And the other thing I just wanted to say, coming from being an academic within a university who's interested in widening participation, if you're struggling within your own teams to think through some of these things, do reach out to the colleagues that you might have elsewhere in your institutions who will probably be very interested and happy to support you in thinking through those things. So obviously that's not going to be true for all providers, but certainly in a lot of institutions there will be other people in the institution who have the skills and are working on these things in their everyday lives, and do draw on their resources and expertise to support you in what you're doing.
Thank you. Finally, Becky.
So the Education Endowment Foundation is the What Works Centre for Education to 18, complementing Tay so nicely. And of course, we're primarily focused on supporting the attainment of kids from socially disadvantaged backgrounds. So I'm fascinated by this debate. I think the evidence-led approach is the thing. That's the starting point. And then my cheat is that there are a series of things underlying that, some of which have been already mentioned by colleagues. But first of all, diagnostics. What is it that you're seeking to achieve? What is the particular issue in your local context where you can offer the best value or where the need is greatest? And then, as we've heard, thinking about, in relation to your response to that, the theory of change. Not just what have we got available, or, what can we get our hands on, but what is a convincing proposition that will address the key problems or outcome measures that your diagnostics have identified. Then, as we've heard, use of the existing evidence base. You know, there's no point reinventing wheels. Do draw on resources like the EEF's Teaching and Learning Toolkit, which is a digest of high-quality international evidence on raising attainment and most plausible best bets to do that. And, of course, amazing existing offers that we have around the table today. Then thinking about implementation. There's a huge literature on this now, showing, you know, it's not just what evidence is out there, but it's also how you implement that effectively on the ground. Doing a few things well tends to be a much better prospect than a scattergun of ambitious stuff, but that doesn't resonate. Then evaluating so that we can learn. And when I say we can learn, the final point is that collectivity. You know, this has to be a cross-sector approach where dissemination is transparent, including what didn't work so that we can learn from that, and where that evidence is shared. And I'm really proud to say that in the school system, you know, half the schools in the country have been involved in one of the EEF's trials and quasi-experimental designs. We're really proud of that. It feels like a collective effort to spread that research evidence. And I think that this, you know, all the tools are there in higher education, and this could be really exciting.
Great, so my brief is to make sure that the audience gets a chance to ask questions, because this is a practical challenge. We do appreciate that, and we've got an expert panel here to answer your questions. So please, I'm going to now go to the audience. I'm going to take 2 questions from the audience first and then go up to the booth for online. So please raise your hand and I will direct a mic to you. So I've got one over here. If you could also please say your name and where you're, which institution you're from, please.
Hi, Alex Blair from Archie University, Bournemouth. Given the panel's range of expertise within evidence-led activity and evaluation, it'd be really good to get your thoughts on a drive that's been around the sector for years and years to raise aspiration and use aspiration-raising activity as a measure of success with regards to higher education participation. And I'm aware that there's a lot of research conducted in that area, and I thought it would be really, really useful perhaps for the panel to reflect on their thoughts on whether that should be where the sector should be focusing its efforts.
Okay, I'm going to take one more. This was a question actually that we talked about before we sat down, so the panel were, I think, ready for it. So I've got a gentleman in the back on the same side.
Hello, my name is Rory. I'm from Central Film School. I'm a micro provider based in London. I'm just wondering what your perspective would be on the measures such as Polar 4 and IMD and actually as accurate measures of deprivation and therefore targeting of our activity. Obviously there's a lot of research coming out at the moment saying that they're not accurate for various different reasons, and it's an intersection and all those kinds of things. So it would be great to hear your perspective on that, because obviously we've got these measures to target our activity against.
Yeah, very good questions. I think both quite practical, but also a little bit detailed on the technical questions of measurement. And notable also that obviously raising attainment in schools does use a different measure of disadvantage, arguably, than the measures we use in access and participation. So, Angela, do you mind if I start with you? You can answer either of those. Either the question of the extent to which aspiration raising is something we should aim for. I suppose implicit also in that question, does aspirations raising link to attainment? Or the question of the measurement of disadvantage, whether Polar 4 or IMD are appropriate. In the context especially, I think, of raising attainment. Sorry.
Thank you for those questions. 2 really good questions. I'm going to concentrate a little bit on the aspiration question, because I think your question was really like, how closely does it link to attainment, and therefore, like, should we focus on it as a sort of intermediate outcome in the way that Susie was talking? And I think that's an important question, and probably colleagues around the table know the evidence better than I do. But I would query really whether that matters. So obviously it matters from a Office for Students perspective, and I'm currently getting a look from John. So I think that's very important. But if you think about young people that you're working with, surely raising aspirations is something we want to do in itself. So yes, whether or not it links to attainment is important, but I think it's also as an important thing in itself. And therefore, when you're thinking about what it is that your organisation wants to do, it strikes me as something that will probably be on the table regardless of its link to attainment.
Susie?
Yeah, so I'll come in on that as well. I'll disagree ever so slightly, which I'm sure we're meant to do on a panel. So I think raising aspirations is important, but I do think there's been a sort of growing evidence base that actually a lot of pupils from different groups have a similar level of aspiration. They want to get to university, or they want something for to achieve a lot in their life. But the difference is around that self-belief and what we call at the Brilliant Club that sense of self-efficacy, which can get chipped away as you progress through the education system. And I think for us, moving the focus more to self-efficacy and programs like the Scholars Programme and a little bit the Sutton Trust programs, Access Project, where the intervention, you're doing it. So you're not just being told about it. You're not just being told you can get to university. Actually, if you go through the Scholars Programme, by the end of it, you've studied in a tutorial setting, you've written in a university-style assignment. You know that you can do it, and I think that's probably where I'd shift it a little bit more from just pure aspirations.
Just to follow up a little bit, if a provider were interested in trying to measure self-efficacy instead of, say, aspirations or in addition to, what would they be asking instead, right? What would they be asking participants on a program?
Yeah, so we use questions on our pre and post surveys around self-efficacy, and it is around that self-belief that university is right for me. It brings in some of the themes around that sense of belonging, that sense of self-belief. So it's more shifting to that focus.
Thank you. Sorry to follow up there, but Claire, I was curious if you had, on either question, really.
Yeah, I think, agree on the aspiration side. I think it needs to be coupled with other things. Perhaps I would also add, given that we're in an attainment raising session, we don't want to raise aspirations for people who do not have a realistic prospect, I guess, of being able to get there. So it's about building the attainment, the kind of skills that people would need to be able to follow the path that they're interested in, as well as having the belief to do so, and so on. On the measurement question, I think this is it's data that we kind of wrestle with ourselves in doing work that tries to document and explore the drivers of socioeconomic gaps in schools, as well as in higher education attainment and progression and so on. Essentially, we're working with the data that we have at our disposal. So in the school system, we have the free school meal eligibility measure. That's brilliant for identifying the pupils who are kind of at the particularly lower end of the parental income spectrum, but it's really not very helpful at all in distinguishing those who are more in the middle versus those who are more at the top end of the spectrum. So the kind of pupils who are just missing out, whose parents might be in fairly low paid work, we are not able to identify through that measure, and that's where the kind of area level measures have been helpful, and we've used those to supplement the free school meal eligibility information in our own work, on the basis that if you don't observe anything else about the pupils, perhaps knowing something about the type of area in which they live might help you to kind of get a better idea of whether they're in the middle versus the very top of the socioeconomic spectrum. But obviously there is a question mark. There is going to be mismeasurement. It's not that areas are totally segregated. You will misidentify some people in one direction or another. I think if we can move to a world in which we are able to access the individual level measures for higher education access purposes, that would be brilliant. But they also, as I mentioned, do have their own challenges. So I think probably a combination of the two is always going to be useful until we get to the world in which we can observe a more kind of continuous measure of pupil socioeconomic background, which I know the Department for Education are working on.
Yeah, I'd be interested in your responses, but also maybe what EEF has done in addition to free school meals, because I know that you've obviously used free school meals as an important measure, but you have also, I think, run trials looking beyond that population.
Yeah, thanks. Building on Susie's points about aspiration, the evidence on aspiration mechanisms is actually very weak. Very undeveloped, and I also agree that there's very scant evidence to support need Actually, a lot of the research seems to suggest that working class kids actually have very high aspirations. Often the problem is that they don't know how to get there, how the game is played, or indeed have the quality resource to build on, as we were hearing in the earlier sessions. So I think, though, when we come to outcome measures and thinking about where we're trying to help, there is something about developing social and cultural capital, those rules of the game, the resources that kids can take to their journey towards university, and developing, of course, crucially within that, attainment as well. A good example here, I think, is Children's University, which was mentioned earlier, an intervention that has shown through an EF trial that it supports 2 months additional progress, as well as having outcome measures around familiarity, those additional social skills, that additional cultural capital and so forth that kids are drawing on through those activities that they're participating in. So again, I think it's, what are we trying to achieve and how do we attain that? And then in relation to the measures, yes, I mean, there was a really important piece of work done at UCL led by John Jerram and others, I think, within CPO, actually, Claire, where working with the widening participation team, it looked as though in the London context, particularly, ACORN was probably the most useful measure, but of course, again, paid for. The call for free school meals data to be available in the HE sector, I think we would all reiterate that. That's really important. And I think, Omar, you were getting at something slightly different. You were talking about, again, sort of proximity measures. Obviously, attainment is something that the EF focuses on always primarily, but that we also look at other outcome measures, sometimes self-efficacy, sometimes self-regulation, well-being, and so forth. So definitely, I think that having additional measures can be useful, although again, I would recommend do focus on one primary measure and again think about targeting your theory of change there, because otherwise, as the researchers in the room know, things can quickly unravel.
Great, excellent answers. I'm going to take some now from the online audience.
Hi, a question here. A child's GCSE grades can be attributed to a lot of factors, for example, quality teaching, parent support and interventions from universities. How can universities successfully attribute an increase in attainment to an intervention when there are so many others involved in supporting the child? Any good examples that you've got would be really welcomed.
Very good question. I'm going to just take one more from the online audience.
Okay. We're also wondering about how to evaluate programs that might target small groups, so where samples might not be big enough to follow through on experimental kind of approaches. Are there any ideas that the panel might have for how that could be done?
Great. So the first question was on attribution, and in particular, given there is a lot of activity to raise attainment, especially by schools, but also by parents, by charities, how can universities be confident that their particular intervention or activity is making a difference? I'll start. I'm going to go this way this time, so I'll start with Becky.
Thank you. Yeah, so really, I guess this comes down to the crucial question, what can universities do, right? And I think there are different ways that we can go at this, and I would reiterate, building on the existing research evidence rather than necessarily reinventing wheels. So first of all, I think thinking about strategies that directly support attainment. Now, again, we know from the OFS's recent publication that I think you'll have had access to today, there's a whole raft of different approaches that could be taken here. Some of them are particularly well evidenced if you look at our teaching and learning toolkit. An example I'll give here is tutoring. And this is something that, universities have an amazing resource. Their undergraduate and postgraduate students, often subject specialists, often passionate about their subject areas, mobilising these resources for schools in evidence-led ways such as tutoring, which on a one-to-one level can generate 5 months progress, for school children, or for small group tutoring 3 to 4 months progress, this is an amazing resource, and obviously partnering with organisations like the Brilliant Club and others give you a really great handle and a really well-evidenced handle to take this forward. As I say, other successful approaches can be found on our toolkit, and I think it's important to say some of our best and most successful programmes have been developed by academics. I'll give you the example of the Nuffield Early Language Intervention, which was developed by academics at Oxford in partnership with the Nuffield Foundation, developing an approach to support young children struggling with oracy and early language. This is one of our most successful interventions that's been scaled up during the pandemic nationally. So I think, again, capitalising on the university's research expertise is a real way that you can help. Then we have, as I've said, strategies that directly support the cultural and social capital of pupils in state schools, with potential benefit for attainment as well. I mentioned Children's University, but also we heard earlier from Amanda about careers and access advice, governance, university governance, again, to draw on your academic expertise for school governance. I think is an amazing resource to support that curriculum excellence and so forth as well.
Sorry, I'm just going to turn to Claire now.
Thanks. So I guess I'd add to what Becky was saying in really using the evidence base to focus on those intermediate outcomes rather than necessarily the kind of final goal of GCSE grades, which obviously, as the questioner rightly said, are going to be affected by myriad factors, and if your programme is a small component part of that, it's quite difficult to show the value there, especially if you're if you're intervening earlier and we're having to wait quite a long time to show it. I'd also echo exactly what Becky was saying in terms of thinking what your university value, what is your comparative advantage, what do you have that is different to what schools might be able to do. Tutoring is a great example. Greg mentioned in the earlier session, teacher training is another one. A lot of universities will have that. That's a fantastic way of delivering messages about attainment raising and all those things directly into schools in your local area and elsewhere. I think, Becky, the top thing on the EEF toolkit is the kind of metacognition type idea, how to learn to be a good independent learner. That's obviously a fantastic skill for all students, especially those coming to higher education, which requires quite a different skill set to what they might have come across earlier in the system. So perhaps thinking about the types of programs that develop that, which will be good for students who arrive at your institution as well as more widely. Just touching on the small group initiative point, I think it is really difficult if you're just working with a small number of pupils to demonstrate your impact directly, but perhaps thinking about partnering with other practitioners who might be trying to do a similar thing would be one way to think about it. And actually, if you're kind of on the end of the spectrum where you might be considering something like a randomised control trial, which is obviously a good way to demonstrate a causal impact, then you actually don't need massive numbers in order to be able to demonstrate that if your programme is quite effective at achieving the outcomes that you have in mind. So it's not beyond the realms of possibility that you can do very successful evaluations even with relatively small numbers of students.
Yeah, I'm going to make a little pitch here for Tezo, using my chair's position. We are developing some guidance on working with small cohorts in the HE sector. And we'll be piloting it with a number of providers shortly, including colleges as well as HE universities. So watch that space, because we are conscious that even in ordinary evaluation activities, not even raising attainment, the small and specialist providers have identified this as a challenge for them. And even larger providers who have maybe small cohorts or cohorts that are inherently small. So, yes, sorry.
Yeah, so
if you could pick up both those questions if you can. But,
yeah, we'll do. So just to start off on the attainment raising, and I think it's probably important to share where we're at in the Brilliant Club with our journey on this. And I think, I know John is keen that it's a space for us all to be open and honest. And we are on a journey. So we know that the Scholars Programme does have a positive impact on outcomes that are related to attainment raising. So we've talked about self-efficacy, things like critical thinking, independent learning. But we've had, as we are launching our next 5-year strategy, we've had to think, we work with a lot of students across the UK. There are some students who will develop the confidence and the skills to get to university, but then as they're getting nearer, whether it's to GCSE level or to A levels, perhaps they are going to fall short of the grades. And is there anything else that we, along with our university partners and school partners, can do to support those pupils to help just to edge them up to get the grades that they need? And the honest answer is we're working through that. We've seen the National Tutoring Programme was a kind of a response in the midst of a crisis. So great that a lot of money was put to it. We've seen in our delivery, we've seen some really positive impact, but we've also seen what can happen when a programme is sort of thrown in the mix very quickly without there being enough chance to really think about the effective implementation. So what we want to do now is take some of the learnings from the NTP. Then Lauren, my colleague who's in the audience, our Chief Impact and Strategy Officer, is working with her team to really evaluate the evidence base, do the literature reviews, and then critically do that collaboration with schools and university partners. In the speed of having to get the NTP up and running, that collaboration with schools was probably the bit that was missing. And I think we want to get that balance of, yes, you need national programmes like the Scholars Programme, but you also do need those sort of local place-based approaches. And we're hearing from schools that they don't just want a menu of activities on attainment raising. They do want to have a bit of a stake in that collaboration, co-creation. So, you've got to be realistic. That's probably, it's not going to be creating a new project for every area. It will be looking at the evidence base, using the EEF toolkit, using the TASO research, and then maybe working with the local schools and universities to think, well, what do we need in your particular context? And, we're really keen, whether it's us supporting the delivery of that or whether it's our evaluation and consultancy team just supporting that theory of change process. We think it's important to lean into it. We just don't know all the answers yet, and I think it will take a collaborative effort to get there.
I think that's a really helpful message actually for the audience, so that you're not alone in trying to learn what works here. We're all learning as we're doing this, but there is some evidence that's stronger than others, so do look at that evidence. Sorry, I was also going to ask you, because we haven't really talked about charities as well, and one of the thoughts I had, I know that you've done some work on how we can work with charities, and maybe for small providers it might be a good additional or intermediary partner where we have small colleges or universities.
Yes, can I take that one?
Yes.
So I think the two questions about attribution about small sizes are quite linked, actually. And we've talked a lot about basing your work on the evidence base that exists. And then Becky mentioned earlier the idea of implementation. Implementation is really important. When we think about measuring impact, we think about 5 types of data, of which we've talked about some already today. So user data, feedback data, engagement data, outcomes data, which Susie was talking about the importance of, and then impact data. And realistically, for a lot of organisations, small organisations, impact data, it will be very hard to get in any meaningful way. And that then makes it very hard to attribute impact. And I actually think in terms of knowing whether you're doing the right things, whether they're likely to work, a really good method is to look very carefully at the evidence base, think about what the implementation factors are that made that a good quality intervention, try and have as much as you can fidelity to that method, and then measure that using feedback and engagement data. And that gets you a lot of what Susie was talking about earlier in terms of when we do this parental engagement, does it seem to work? And you can start to figure out things a lot more easily if you're measuring all of those 5 types of data. So that's what I would say to the smaller organisations, is to think very carefully about the priorities of what you're collecting and how you use the data, and think, does it necessarily have to be impact data? Because you can prove a lot, you can make a very good sort of argument by talking about what you've done and then linking it to the existing evidence base rather than measuring everything yourself. And then on the attribution point, I suppose my question here is, why do you need to attribute? Children and young people are incredibly complicated, and realistically, your intervention is not going to be the thing that helps them. It's going to be a contribution to one of many things that are helping them. we're trying constantly to be driving up attainment through a number of methods, many of which are on the panel here today. So you are a contribution to that. And I think trying to think about actually what are we doing that's different, how are we contributing, is probably more important than any sort of causal attribution of our work over other things. So those are the two answers that I had prepared while the others were talking.
Yeah, no, I'll go back to the audience, but I would like to take up this question of maybe someone in the audience wants to ask about working with charities as well. So we've got two more from the floor I can take now. Oh, good. Actually, I've got 3 hands up, I think. One here, I think.
Mike Nicholson, University of Cambridge. I'm interested in one of the things that we've been encouraged to think about in the new guidance, which is whether we can mark our own homework. And my concern is that we could run the risk of a proliferation of people offering to come and take our money off us to do that job for us without necessarily knowing the context in which we're working. But equally, I'm conscious that there is a concern that we haven't necessarily been particularly open about what works, and more importantly, what doesn't work. Where does this particular panel see the balance lying? Because my concern is that effectively we end up setting up a whole new stream of income for people to tap into without us necessarily getting any further to the truth of what we need to be doing.
Yeah, tough but important question. Can you please raise your hands high, because I can't quite see if you have a question. I think there's one behind you, and then there's one on the left-hand side in the back, and then we'll come back to the panel.
Actually, my question is improving access of Russell group of universities, especially UCL. I'm not directly asking a question. Your admission criteria is A and B. But improving access of, according to regulatory notice 1 from BEM, that means Black, Asian, minority ethnic groups, white who are not interested to go to the university, caregivers, and socio-economic for low socio-economic background students from East London area and some of the other area north of England. If they will not be able to achieve A and B, then what is the strategy of UCL University or Cambridge University like this to access this type of student? Whether do you have any strategy or any facility to admit them, or you are reducing your admission criteria?
Okay, I'm going to take one more in the back. Sorry, I think the mic is there.
Hello, Carol Portman-Smith from the Brunel University Urban Scholars Programme. I've had the luxury today for the first time in 2 years of being able to talk to a whole variety of people from within this sector. And we switched 2 years ago from a proposed mentoring programme to a tutorial programme with the permission of our sponsors. And we're obviously evaluating that. But one thing that came out of my discussions today was maybe we missed a trick, because there were 40% of students that did not sign up for that tutorial programme. So my question is, do you think sometimes if we are able to do it, if we're in a position to do it, we should look at students who aren't taking the opportunities, and alongside evaluating the impact for those that did take the opportunity, find out the reasons why those students didn't actually engage?
Great. So that's 3 questions. I don't know. Maybe I'll start again with you, Angela, but maybe pick 1 or 2 of those. You don't feel the need to answer all of them.
So I'll start with that last one, in that I think that is a really important question. Who isn't taking part in the activities? And I appear to be banging a drum here for user data, but I think it's really important. It's not just who is using the service, but who isn't using the service. And I think that links slightly to the sort of question about some of the really hard to reach groups that organisations might be trying to sort of participate access with, and trying to work out exactly what you're trying to do in these areas. And this is, I think, somewhere where the third sector can really help providers here, because there often are groups that have a much better links into these types of communities, into care leavers, into the sort of Gypsy Roma traveller community that an organisation will have. And I think that's a really important way to sort of leverage your impact here.
Great, thank you. Susie?
So yeah, I'll quickly pick up on that point and then move on to Mike's point around the evaluation. So yeah, just to back, I think, everything you say, at the Brilliant Club, we're doing much more on our next strategy around parental engagement and more place-based community work, and we just think there is a real need for that. It's really important you have the kind of national programmes like the Scholars Programme that are codified, but if we just relied on that, we're not getting into the community and really understanding what are the barriers in that local community and what can we do to support those, or how do we need to adapt our programmes in light of those. So the main thing we're doing is scaling up an initiative called Parent Power, which was really successfully delivered by King's College London and then Oldham. And that's really about developing parent leaders, so you can understand with groups of parents from underrepresented backgrounds what those barriers and issues are. I'll come to Mike's point there around evaluation. I think it is a balance, is probably where I'd come as a happy compromise. Obviously, we've got an in-house evaluation team at the Brilliant Club, so they do a lot of our data analysis, they produce the impact reports, and they do a lot of our evaluation and also support other organisations with evaluation. But we did realise a few years back that if we just relied on that, A, we might be missing out on some learning, but B, we wouldn't have that kind of objectivity that you get from having someone external. So it was actually Cambridge who came to do a RCT for us, and that was really helpful. It actually really pinpointed the importance of university self-efficacy as being one of our main outcomes. We hadn't realised quite how important that was compared to the other outcomes, so we learnt more from it, and I think it just gave us a robustness that we might have not had without it. So I'd probably go for a balance of the two.
Yeah, and I was curious if you have a view on that one also, because arguably there are different universities are big entities, and there might be one bit of the universities that's doing an intervention and another bit that I think you'd made a plea to sort of reach across the aisle to your research colleagues.
Yeah, I just jotted down almost exactly the same point, actually. So I think, I agree it's going to be a balance. I guess I would say there are different types of evaluation. So obviously, if you're thinking about the formative side of things, then that probably is something you should be doing internally, because you will have the best understanding of how your programs are working on the ground and what types of thing could be usefully used to inform those, perhaps in combination with user data. If you are looking for something that's a bit more objective, but not necessarily looking to a kind of external consultant, academics within your own institution may be a kind of low-cost alternative to that. So there will be people who are interested in doing it because they are kind of passionate about that themselves. But also, if you can offer them an opportunity to do a kind of really good, solid evaluation that will get them an academic publication, that will also be an incentive. You can offer them incentives to do it as well if that is a challenge to identifying the kind of right people to do it. In terms of access to Russell Group universities, so I have no part to play in UCL's admissions policy myself, but obviously I know that it is taken very seriously in UCL, as it is in many other Russell Group universities. There is a lot of work going on across the board in terms of thinking about how to widen access. Attainment raising is going to be an important part of that jigsaw puzzle. That's obviously a fairly long-term goal, though. If we knew how to improve the attainment of low socioeconomic groups, we would have done it already. So we're still learning about the best ways to do that, and it's going to be a kind of work in progress. In the meantime, from my own research and from my own perspective, I would say contextual admissions should absolutely be part of the process for universities who are interested in widening access. There's kind of good evidence that small reductions in grades are not going to risk admitting students who can't cope with the course. I think we know less about very big reductions in entry in terms of whether that does set students up to fail or whether they may go on to struggle more in accessing the material once they're there. But I think coupling that with greater support for students once they're actually at universities, it can be a kind of important building block while we're in the process of reducing the socioeconomic and ethnic gaps in access.
Well, I'd like to do a plug for UCL, actually, showing a sort of invested interest here, because I used to be co-chair their innovative widening participation group, and I know that they have a very strongly evidence-led contextual admissions programme, which has been implemented in the last couple of years, and I think this year going forward as well. So actually, I think that students from the backgrounds that you mentioned, sir, should have a good prospect, because they've taken quite a radical approach to dropping grades for disadvantaged students as well. And I think this comes back to those earlier comments I made about the importance of diagnostics, what type of university you are, whether, for example, you're a selective or a recruiting university, what your context is, and so forth. I'm fascinated by the question about independent evaluation. For the EF, we always commission a separate external evaluator, and that ability to evaluate and then publish without fear or favour has been sort of central to the success of the EF model, I think. But I absolutely agree with you about when you're, representing a series of research organisations, why would you proliferate or spend unnecessary capital? And it strikes me that there might be a role for some kind of brokering organisation or facility here, almost a kind of swapping model, if you like. But I do think, again, as Susie and others have said, the importance of independence, that additional credibility, but that for your findings, and additional kind of grit and rigour that is brought there, is very important for learning and for identifying, importantly, what doesn't work.
So we have 5 minutes, 4 probably. Can I take a few from the online audience?
Yeah, we've got a question. So what evidence could providers draw on to determine which schools and pupils to focus on, and how might the panel approach this?
Should I take one more and then that will be it, probably, yeah?
Yep. So another one from asking what your advice is for higher education providers who don't offer teacher training or have the expertise in attainment raising, and how they might approach supporting and engaging schools.
Yeah, 2 very good questions. So first, how do you identify schools? There are many more schools than there are providers, and we've heard quite a lot of discussion about matching locally, but how would you identify which schools? And I suppose, for those institutions that don't offer teacher training or have schools of education, how would they work? And what's your advice to working with them? Where to start? So I'll start with you, Becky, and I think we'll go this way, and this will probably be our last set of questions.
Thanks. I mean, which schools? I think this, to some extent, again, depends on those diagnostics, both about, obviously, the spread of attainment and the different situations of schools in your region, but also what is it that you want to offer in relation to raising attainment? Is it something that potentially you can offer nationally through partnering with national organisations, or is it something that's necessarily going to be very local? If it's going to be very local, then thinking through about a set of criteria or metrics that you develop in relation to, for example, the most challenged schools, and thinking about schools' demographics will be important. But I think that point about matching what is it that you can offer, and then thinking about both the scale and nature of the schools and pupils concerned is probably the best starting point.
Thank you. Thank you for being concise as well. Thank you, Claire. Sorry.
Thanks. I mean, in terms of identifying schools, I guess there's a tendency probably to work locally where you've got the more intensive interventions. I guess I would just put in a plea to, because there are schools who won't have a university located particularly close to them, so we obviously want to make sure that those schools don't miss out. As an individual institution, it's quite hard to do that, I think, but maybe collectively across the sector we can be, making sure that we're covering the school, giving all schools in the country an opportunity to engage in these types of initiatives. In terms of the kind of how to engage where you don't have teacher training or schools of education, I think I would again recommend thinking about what are the types of skills that students come into your institution have or need to have in order to learn, and could that be kind of usefully translated or shared with the school system. So I'm sure there are many examples, but I guess just things that spring immediately to mind might be around art schools or music schools, those types of things. They are obviously part of the curriculum for large numbers of students and a very important part of the curriculum, and certainly in terms of enrichment activities and so on, that's going to be, could be something that you could usefully offer. There is evidence that those types of things can be useful in terms of attainment more generally. There are certainly skills that would overlap in terms of what kinds of things you need in order to be a good artist or a good musician or a successful a sports person or whatever, that would overlap and have complementarity with attainment as well. So I think it's probably, just again reiterate, what's your comparative advantage? What can you bring that might be different to what other institutions can bring? That would also be useful for children in the school system.
Thank you. Susie?
Yeah, I'll just briefly touch on the which schools question, and I'd maybe slightly flip it and say which leaders, which school leaders. So I do think, particularly if it's a new initiative, that kind of contact mapping of who are those leaders in that particular area who might be able to really input and help develop and drive a new attainment raising initiative. I think that's really important. So we had an example of it with our new transition programme during the DOCS, and that really came from a couple of school leaders. So Ed Venker, who's CEO of the Reach Foundation, and then Jan Ballon, who is head teacher of London Academy of Excellence. And the idea came from them because they were saying there is this gap, there isn't this connection between schools and universities in our area as strong as it should be in the transition to university. But via having two very sort of energised and visionary school leaders, they were then able to mobilise a number of schools and universities, and we can engage in really meaningful sort of co-production and co-creation together. So I don't know how we almost want to share that knowledge of like who are those school leaders you want to get on board first of all, and then of course you need to think about those schools that might feel left behind. But it helped us hugely recognising those kind of influential figures.
Angela, you've got the last comment.
On terms of how you identify schools, I thoroughly endorse what Becky says. It's all about what you're trying to achieve and making your diagnostics based on that. And then about thinking about sort of where that's a harder relationship to make. I'm going to say that schools and providers are not the only people in this relationship. There are lots of really good charities working in this area, of which the Brilliant Club is one. I know the Access Project and Inter-University are here today as well, and there are others as well. Lots of people are concerned about this. I work with a lot of philanthropists who would love to partner with a university and a charity and to really drive forward this. So this is an area that so many people are interested in, and I don't think you should narrow who you're working with.
Great. So I think this panel has shown that there is evidence of what works. Obviously, when you're thinking about your interventions, try to refer to that evidence, look at the EEF toolkits, look at what other organizations like the Brilliant Club are already doing, look at the evidence of academics like Claire. We've also got a toolkit on Tezo's webpage. I know I'm standing between you and lunch at this point, so I won't go on any further. I think that it's clear, though, from this panel that there's a lot of evidence of what works out there, but there's more that we need to learn. If you could thank the panel in the ordinary way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That was fantastic. I took this job mostly to listen to and talk to interesting people, so it's just another fantastic chance to do that. This is now lunch. There is another chance to speak with the organisations who are exhibiting in the hall. Please do go and engage with them and understand the work they're doing. And we will begin again at 1:25. Thank you very much.